Planning Commission Working Group to order. Thank you all for coming. First off, I'd like to welcome our new Planning Commissioner, Dr. Rob Rose. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Looking forward to working with you. I'd also like to welcome, we have three consultants with us who've been a tremendous help to the CPT since the beginning of this process. Mr. Vlad Gavrilovic, Todd Gordon, and on the telephone, Leanne King. And so welcome to you three also. First off, may I please have a motion to approve the minutes of the September 26th, 2019 meeting?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. New business, Ms. Rosario.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today is the second meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group, this body that's been assembled to oversee the technical review of our comprehensive plan throughout this entire update process that we're calling Engage 2045. This is a collaborative effort, and so today I'm joined by Vlad Gavrilovic and Todd Gordon from EPR, who will join me in the presentation, as well as Leanne King from Clarion, who will participate in our discussion. The first half of our meeting will be focused on the summary of the Phase 1 public engagement efforts, after which we will pause for some question and answer and discussion. The second half will focus on an update of the Phase 2 scenario modeling efforts, and again, we'll pause for question and answer and also some discussion. And finally, we'll touch upon our next steps as we move through this process, gearing toward a summer of 2021 adoption. The Engage 2045 process builds upon the tradition of past comprehensive plans with a heavy emphasis on public engagement, reaching out to the public, inviting them to share their ideas so that, as our slogan says, they can shape our community. The overall intent is reinforced by the fact that our process is front-loaded with significant engagement efforts, and this one is dubbed this Phase 1, Listening and Envisioning. For those who haven't been part of previous discussions, or for those viewing from home, this process is really two parallel efforts interwoven together. There's the project phase, which is divided into 5 phases, and we are in laying the foundation right now and getting geared for scenario model building, moving through alternative futures, affirming the direction, and then implementation. Simultaneous with that is our community engagement effort. As were mentioned just previously, this phase that we're just concluding is called Listening and Visioning, and we're right there. Moving toward exploring and testing, then deciding and affirming, and finally ending with planning and implementing. So at each stage of our project and community engagement, we're looping back to this body as well as the Board of Supervisors to inform you of what we've heard as well as what we've learned moving along. The public engagement efforts have been led by a wonderful team of 10 citizens, 4 planning commissioners, and 6 citizens at large, reflecting the diversity of our community. They've worked diligently with the consultants and staff to outline 7 objectives for this effort. This allows us not only to plan the citizen engagement opportunities with intention, but also to measure our results along the way. I won't read all of these, but some of the ones we'll hone in on today. Community members will be given the choice and access to engage in the planning process through multiple activities. Educational opportunities will advance the community's understanding of critical planning issues. Will reflect the engagement and the representation that we get. Will seek to engage a diversity of residents that's representative of the community, and will ensure that participants' opinions are respected, well documented, and will help inform policy direction in the plan. I said I wouldn't read all of them, but we're also looking for this effort to inspire trust, continued engagement, that we can share with people how their inputs have been used throughout the process. And one that was important to our CPT as far as a measurement, that the engagement will be record-breaking and surpass statistics of past planning efforts. So phase one of this process, listening and envisioning, was intended to maximize our yield as far as participation, but also meet our objectives. We know in James City County, we're blessed with an engaged, well-informed citizenry, but we also know that it's getting increasingly difficult to entice citizens to break from their busy schedules and participate in events. So during early discussions with the community participation team, we were challenged as staff and the consultants to think about ways that we might maximize involvement within our resources. So we turned to technology to create an innovative format for the Summit on the Future, which was held November 18th. We had 6 coordinated sites from which we would simulcast our presentation in an online polling event. Then we broke into a number of activities. Many of these opportunities were mirrored in post-Summit online activities. This was an option that was open from November 18th through December 18th, and that involved continuation of polling and station questions online. This format, coupled with extensive outreach, we feel resulted in some great numbers, and not just participants, but data points and comments that helped us drill down on major items from the citizen survey, and also that we could fold into the next stage of our process. So at our meeting, we had 185 live polling participants. And through our extended effort online following the meeting, we were able to add to that 256 additional online polling participants for a total of 441 total participants. And as I mentioned, we also yielded a significant number of data points, 878 from our preserve change mapping exercise, and 250 from our visual preference survey.
Tammy, are you going to mention how much more this is from 5 years ago?
Exactly. So I think the CPT was particularly proud that these engagement numbers really surpassed the past 2 comprehensive plan engagement opportunities. You can see that our very last effort in 2015, which we called the 2035 comprehensive plan, we had 77 in-person participants at as a combination of 3 different locations. We did not tally into this our online comments because they were sort of a distinctly different effort along the way. But you can also see that when we go back to 2008 for the 2009 comprehensive plan, our round 1 total was 149. So even just the in-person participant level was higher than both of those, but then we really bumped up those numbers with our online engagement opportunity the month following. Yes?
There's still opportunities for people to make themselves heard, are there not?
Absolutely.
Even phase 1's over, but that doesn't mean people can't make their opinions known.
Yes, we continue on a continual basis to have a comment card essentially available on the website, a way for people to participate in getting the newsletter. But we are planning additional opportunities and in-person engagement opportunities later on in the process.
Before you go off on that, one thing that struck me when I looked at the details of this thing were the demographics for the face-to-face numbers, where it came out to over 55. But your online was under 55. And so for me, for the first time, do I see a demographic dispersion over an N value of over 300 that to me is statistically significant. But it also gets to a question that Jack and I have had is, people are just tired, they're happy about it. Well, it's really the way you outreach, and the online piece to reach that demographic element of that, I think, is significant. And I hope that you continue to look at opportunities for the online, especially as you come to asking folks, what is it that you think about what we're doing now, that you figure out a way to do that so that it ties that not back to those issues that they thought were important for.
Good point. We're hoping to mirror these sorts of efforts in our future phases of engagement. And we very much hoping that the way that we set up these meetings also entices people to be involved and continue involvement. And so a couple of objectives that we tried to achieve through the agenda, one was tied to the informational portion to advance the community's understanding of critical planning issues, was really tied into our summit presentation. Many people don't understand what a comprehensive plan is, what our process is, and we needed to inform them of that, as well as give them some context regarding what is James City County's experience now, what has it been in the past, what do we project it to be in the future. And we had a very significant citizen survey effort back in April, and we had the results of that in July. And so we wanted to make sure people understood what we yielded from that and how we were trying to use this opportunity to further our understanding of those findings. And so the activities that we had planned, both through the community polling and the station activities, were really intended to offer people that choice and access that we had as one of our objectives. There were mapping exercises, there was a visual preference survey, and there was an opportunity just for general sharing of ideas through Share Your Big Ideas. The community polling, I just want to elaborate a bit, was through people's smartphones, although we had ways for people to engage on paper if they felt more comfortable that way, so no one was left out. But the opportunity that gave us to do the community polling was that instantaneously people across the different venues could see the results tallied before their eyes. Just some examples of the kind of information that we gave people at the summit in the presentation. We talked about population and growth, comparisons to other localities with respect to our past and future growth, key facts about education, diversity, and income, and housing affordability. Obviously, many more topics were covered. This gave people information that they might be able to use to help answer those questions and provide commentary later on in the activities. Following the in-person summit, we made a significant outreach effort through our website, through our newsletter, and not just the newsletter from our Engage 2045 website, but we shared it with multiple organizations and groups around the community. We did a lot of posts on Facebook, Twitter, and Nextdoor, which was very engaging and allowed us to, I think, really reach some significant segments of the population. And we did flyers. Our CPT, I just want to add, really helped us out in getting to different activities and opportunities throughout the community. So that really helped us boost our numbers, and as Mr. Polster said, really broaden our reach. With that, I'll turn it over to Vlad to give us a general overview.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you for having us back on this balmy spring day. I'm going to share an overview of the various types of exercises and outreach efforts and the summary of the public input. And Todd is going to share some summary themes, kind of takeaways from that public input. Leanne, also on the phone with Clarion, can weigh in on that with any questions, as Clarion really helped us shape this into themes. And happy to answer quick questions as we go, but we also have this kind of 30-minute block afterwards for overall discussion. So first kind of question or issue was, how well did the demographics of participants in these outreach efforts reflect the county overall population from census data? And you can see the comparisons there. The leftmost column is the input received, percentages by different demographic groups. Center column is how that compares to census. And on the right, we actually adjusted that, normalized that for the 18 plus population. So we didn't do specific outreach to the younger demographics. And one of the things you see there is when you adjust for the over 18 population, the primary outreach there, that the results were not that far from the county overall population. So participants were somewhat older than the overall population. You can see the 40, 50, 60 somethings were a little higher than the overall population of the county, but not dramatic change. Participants were somewhat less racially diverse than census data. Again, 84% white on the respondents versus 80% or so on the census data. And participants were somewhat less ethnically diverse than census data, 2.4 on the respondents versus 5.4 on the overall population of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. But I have to say, from where we typically get input of people who have the time to give input, that is quite often in communities weighted towards retirees and older population. And these results are pretty wonderful as far as reflecting the demographics that exist in the county nowadays. So we were very impressed with that. And then this was also a good finding that we asked people if they had participated in county's planning process before. You didn't have the usual suspects. You had a lot of people that really were new to these county planning efforts. 73% had not participated in county planning processes before. And now I want to go through kind of the some of the input we received on these public engagement themes. We'll go into each theme a little more, but these were the overall kind of clusters of themes that we heard in the input. Things about nature and the environment, community character, affordable housing, economic development, and quality of life. And what we did was kind of look at some of the selected or just some sample responses from the polling and the in-person engagement that supported these themes to kind of reflect how we came to have these themes and takeaways. So, for example, 86% of respondents said it was very important for the county to do more to improve our efforts to protect and preserve our natural environment in the county, way higher than the next categories. And notice all of these have that kind of wording, for the county to do more to improve our efforts. And that was working through the community participation team of how to get that worded correctly so that we would get kind of a good kind of reflection of public opinion on these themes. Second was community character or nature. The number one respondent of what contributes the most to create the county's great community character was the natural network of greenery and waterways, about 49%, much higher than the people, the places, the culture, the neighborhoods, things like that. On housing affordability, 84% said it was very or somewhat important that the county to do more to provide housing opportunities that are affordable to our workforce. Fairly strong showing there. And then on economic development, 88% thought it was very or somewhat important for the county to do more to expand the local economy by attracting higher paying jobs, much higher than not important or others. And finally, on quality of life, which had these two kind of aspects to it, growth and economic development, the most important to accomplish was managing growth, 48%. Second was providing a stable economic foundation, 33%. Again, much higher than welcoming diverse array of people or recover from floods or disasters. So those are just some kind of data points that we use to reinforce these takeaways of these major themes. And as Tammy mentioned, we also had a live-work exercise. This was not on the online. This was just kind of a mapping exercise in the in-person summit. But we asked people to put dots on where they live and work. Some quick takeaways. There were more live than work dots, probably representing just not as many people, respondents were in the workforce, they were retired or whatever. Also, a fairly broad population distribution. If you look at where the yellow dots are in the county, it wasn't necessarily clustered in one part of the county or another. And we asked people if they worked outside the county, to put their dots outside the boundaries. And there's a fair number of dots there that show people work outside the county. Again, this is for people that attended the summit. And then we had an in-person and an online visual preference survey and a preserved change map. And I'll go through kind of those responses, but just so you can see the level of response. So there were 104 people that responded in the visual preference survey in person. And then we had an online version. The program is called MetroQuest, so that's why it says MetroQuest responses, with 250 people for a total of 354 responses, which again we think is pretty good because it was a fairly long survey. It took you 10, 15 minutes to get through it. And then a preserved change map. Rather than respondents, we have 878 total individual responses or dots put on the map from both the summit and the online version. And this is the pattern of preserved change dots. So I'll walk through some takeaways, but you can see the general pattern here. Of course, people put preserve dots on natural and scenic and cultural and historic places in the county. Put change dots in areas that were tended to be some of the more settled parts of the county. But we looked particularly at the comments. So people not only put a dot there, but we asked them to identify what they meant by that dot. So some of the general takeaways on the preserve, of course, it's the natural and cultural features, but also communities like Toano and Norge, preserving nature and recreational opportunities, but also community characters. Interesting kind of room for select growth, so accommodating some appropriate growth within those preserved communities. On the change, you look at the kind of places like Grove or Newtown Eastern State Hospital and Lightfoot. Most of the comments there were that these were opportunities for the kind of growth that, or the kind of development, I guess, that people were looking for. So affordable housing ranked big on the responses, and these were looked at as places to provide affordable housing or redevelopment to enhance them, mixed uses, mixed use land and buildings, and need for redevelopment and more employment opportunities. And then lastly, we had this kind of both category where people, certain areas had both green and red dots. The exit 227 area, Toano, Lightfoot area, Monticello Avenue, Brickyard Landing. So people are there saying things like allow some commercial, but keep out of the historic areas, allow some selective infill, recreational opportunities, better connections, bicycle pedestrian connections, things like that. So we got some good input. This is just a scattering of it. Obviously, we have a much more detailed report that you've got a copy of that's posted on the website, and so we can dig into these and use them for both building the scenarios and ultimately for policy development in the comprehensive plan itself. And just to share more on the visual preference survey, so I'll walk through these kind of briskly, but you can study the results more in the report. This was designed really to give us some input on place types. We have, as I'll share in the modeling portion of the presentation, a series of place types that we're using as kind of pieces for modules for our scenario planning. And we wanted to get a sense of both what the kind of density impressions are for these place types from the respondents and the overall visual character. So each of these place types had kind of a density gradient from 1 to 4, from least dense to most dense. But they also had different features of architectural character and form and massing scale, things like that. And some provisional takeaways, I say, because we also ask people to comment on these, and we really need to study the comments in great detail, not just where they put their dots. But for example, on the rural residential place type, a slight preference for a lower density cluster. You can see cluster with more open space got the highest votes. The one on the right is low density residential, and that had some preference for this one on the upper right, which was generally larger lots, wider setbacks, I think one of the CPT members pointed out that you can't necessarily draw the inference that this implies no sidewalks, that people don't like sidewalks, because it wasn't a either or choice, sidewalks or no sidewalks. And when we look into the comments, we found that people generally like sidewalks. I think what people preferred here was the larger lot, wider setbacks in general. And then we move to medium density residential. We see here a pretty strong preference for a lower density kind of detached looking housing type. When you look at the what was presented here, from things that looked more like single family detached houses to things that looked more like row houses, I think there was more of a preference for that detached look. On the right is higher density residential. Here you see that density spectrum. The lowest is number 1 in the upper left, but that wasn't necessarily the highest preference. It was really a preference for what we thought was traditional, fairly dense housing types, but with these kind of social spaces. That's what people commented, particularly on the one on the lower right, was they like those social spaces and landscaping. Local commercial, strong preference here for this kind of Main Street traditional commercial where the buildings front the street and look like traditional storefronts. On the higher intensity commercial, some preference for a lower intensity storefront style, again in the upper left, the building is broken down into more individual storefront blocks or modules. And then on mixed use, on the left is residential commercial. Pretty strong preference, again, for this Main Street type character, lower intensity, not the 5-story on the lower right. And then on the mixed use commercial and office, again, a strong preference for that Main Street 2-3-story brick facing the street type development. And then finally on industrial, the really preference here from the comments was landscaping, open space, lower scale industrial, and not the large blocks. So that was kind of some takeaways from the visual preference survey. And then we also had a big ideas board, and this was kind of an open-ended opportunity for people to share their ideas. There was a number of kind of themes or takeaways here. A big one was transportation. People supported additional connections, particularly bike ped transit improvements to connect where they wanted to go. Environment was also reflected strongly, protecting, and there were kind of 2 dimensions to the environment responses. One was the physical resources, land, trees, resources, but the other was this kind of overarching environmental resiliency, sustainability, promoting recycling and solar. On the economic development, there was support for everything from large tech companies to small businesses, and a number of comments on event centers, either small or larger convention centers that they thought were needed in the county. And finally, some other comments, support for the small town feel, preserving that, revitalizing areas, strong support for the Capitol Trail, parks, and a number of comments supporting mixed-use zoning and mixed-use development. And then, as Tammy mentioned, there's an opportunity to submit online comments, both kind of ranking the most important issues and providing open-ended comments. And this will continue on. This is live now and will continue on throughout the process so we can compare how these are over time. On the question of which of the following is most important to address in the county's comprehensive plan, you can see that rural area protection ranks near the top, public safety, water resources, growth and development, and so on. And, again, this was input as of November 2019, which is when we had the summit, but we will be updating you as the process goes along on these. And then finally, as I mentioned, the report is a summary of public engagement activities, results, and themes with a complete accounting of all these responses. It's you can download the whole report at the Engage 2045 website. Now I'm going to turn it over to Todd to talk about what these overall themes were.
Sure. Well, when you download that document, I'm sure you've all probably already had some familiarity with it, but the document contains 5 public engagement themes, and these are the results of our work as consultants and staff and the community participation team to draw out what we felt were the 5 major takeaways that we found in the public input. We worked, you'll see in the document that there's additional support given to these individual themes that show their foundation, point to the foundation points of the public input and the questions that were answered, the input given to support these themes, and also comparisons to the April 2019 citizen survey, which showed, in our opinion, similar results to support these themes. We worked with the community participation team to not just present these themes, but to refine the language and the words we use to express the themes. And so I will go through the text of these, if that's all right. I think the theme that stood out above all others is the theme of nature. The natural environment is a highly valued component of James City County. Residents support protecting sensitive environmental features such as wetlands, forests, and waterways, becoming more resilient to systemic risks due to sea level rise, availability of drinking water, and water quality, and creating opportunities for residents to enjoy and interact with preserved natural areas within the community. A high proportion of residents reached as a part of this public engagement value protecting nature from the impacts of growth and development. So as I say, this attachment, this idea of preserving the sensitive natural spaces in James City County was predominant within the 5 themes. The second theme is community character, which ties very closely, as you saw in an early polling question that Vlad presented for you. In addition to the natural environment, the county's rural aspects of its community character also are highly valued, including the unique identity of rural communities like Toano, as well as large tracts of open agricultural land away from the county's primary service area, the PSA. To the extent any new development occurs, it should be directed within the PSA away from rural lands. So as Vlad points out, the idea among the community is that character is closely tied to the environment. Affordable housing. Supporting the development of affordable workforce housing has emerged as an important issue to community members. Residential growth should be balanced in a way that provides opportunities for all income levels. Development of additional housing must also be balanced with the preservation of the county's unique community character. Theme 4 is economic development. Residents support economic development that results in recruitment of businesses with higher paying jobs as one way of making the community more economically resilient and appealing to younger professionals. While tourism is a major economic driver in the county, it should be balanced with other employment and industry. And finally, the 5th theme, quality of life. Residents desire additional quality of life amenities, including parks, public water access, expanded recreational facilities, trails for walking and bicycling, transit connections, and other enhancements to existing public facilities. So in our work with staff and with the community participation team, these are the 5 major takeaways that we identified. And I think supported by a lot of detail within the document and the polling and map exercises that back that up. But we'd love to hear your impressions. Yes.
I have a couple. First of all, these 5 themes are also supported by a survey that was made earlier. So the public engagement through the CPT came up with these 5 themes. I agree with the 5 themes. I think that's a logical summary of the work. But also the survey is remarkably close to it. And then I took Mr. Kropp's suggestion from the last CPT meeting and went back and looked at the 2014 survey that was done by a different surveyor, and the questions aren't exactly the same. They don't match up exactly the same, but the message is still the same, I think. If anything, it's intensified from 2014. The need to preserve open space, the need to protect nature and the environment has been a continuing theme, at least since 2014. So, also made this point at the last CPT meeting, but I think you can almost say these 5 themes are just one theme. And there's one theme that runs through all of them, and that is protecting the environment, protecting our unique historic and rural ambience. It's in all 5 themes, and it's an important part of all 5 themes. So.
Yeah, very good.
We're taking minutes, obviously, but this helps us kind of get big picture takeaways from your discussion. So.
There were, since nobody else is going, there were several areas of high importance to survey respondents that were not important to the people at the public engagement. One of them was the Williamsburg Regional Library. Another one, interestingly, was public schools. Very important to survey respondents, not so much to the people with public engagement. And roads and highways. Roads and highways ranked very high on survey respondents and were not mentioned so much in the public engagement.
Well, I think if I'm remembering correctly, we covered some components of that, but not all of that. Obviously, we didn't seek to replicate the citizen survey during the Summit on the Future, but to pick, some of the themes that we really wanted to drill down a little further on and to hear from citizens regarding those items. So I don't know that the citizens were really prompted in the areas of schools and libraries.
I think it's really a function of the demographics of the 2 audiences that you have. So you can go back and see how some of these things correlate just in the visual cue thing when they did those 2. And so it makes sense to me if you've got 55 and under and you've got kids, if you're interested in those issues, as opposed to the audiences that are over 55 and retired, what do they care on that? So I think that's what was impressive to me, was that we got a balance in the demographics of the county, instantiated with the statistics here, that give us a view of both sides of the community, not just one that shows up. And that's significant to me.
One of the things that struck me also is, and I think there's some linkage between the consensus that we need to maybe attract higher paying jobs, more professionals to the county, that tourism will remain an important part of our economic base. But we also have to look towards diversifying that base and bringing in into businesses or other initiatives that are maybe a little more resilient in the case of economic downturns. And I've been an advocate of this for a while, but I also wonder if there's a linkage between the comment that there was more support for mixed use development, wondering if, because oftentimes a component of mixed use is apartments above storefronts. And if you're trying to, one of the issues this county's been grappling with is the lack of housing for the younger professionals. That they find that it's not affordable to live here, and so they look for jobs elsewhere. So, I wonder how much of a linkage there is between the mixed use component and trying to bring in higher paying jobs and different, maybe more diverse technology and other businesses to the county.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this. In fact, I'm not even a layman in this. But I was on the Affordable Workforce Housing Task Force, and that forced me to think a lot about it. One of the things that's striking to me about this discussion about young professionals is they seem to be gravitating toward the most expensive housing markets in the country. If you look, they're going to Northern Virginia, they're going to DC, they're going to Manhattan, they're going to Silicon Valley, they're going to Austin, Texas, because that's where the high-tech jobs are. Yeah. That's where the high-paying jobs are. It's also the most expensive housing in the country. And so your point about the need to attract more well-paying jobs is spot on. That comes first, I think. And the affordable housing will come with that, will come with that, I think. And in fact, if people are paid better, housing becomes more affordable just by virtue of the higher paychecks. So it's a chicken and the egg kind of a thing. There's no question about it. And if it were easy, we'd be doing it, I guess. But
Tell me, Jack, about the number of people in the thousands who work outside of the county but live inside of the county that we saw.
yeah, I won't get these numbers exactly right, but it's almost a perfect balance. Every morning, 18,000 people from someplace else come to James City County to work, and 18,000 people leave James City County to work someplace else.
To live someplace else, you mean?
To work someplace else.
To work someplace else.
People who live in James, 18,000 people, 18,000 James City County residents leave here every morning to work someplace else. And 18,000 people who live someplace else come to James City County to work. And they do it safely. There's no accidents or anything. But it's a and this is referred to in the comprehensive plan. The better paying jobs are elsewhere. And the lower paying jobs are filled by people who can't afford to live here. And so the lower paying jobs attract people who live elsewhere and have to commute long distances to work here. And the people who have higher paying jobs like living in James City County. They like the ambiance and the services and the schools and so forth. But the higher paying jobs are in Newport News or Richmond or someplace else, and so they leave every morning and do that. And
That's interesting.
it's an interesting point. I don't have an answer to that, but that's,
Well, what it says is that we're going to end up as a bedroom community.
we have ended up as a bedroom community.
Exactly.
It's
So,
done.
and that's why you see the preponderance of the responses on the nature and whatever. They're all quality of life issues about why they live here, as opposed down on Denby or whatever. Okay, I mean, that's not why they live. They live here because of our environment, and they're willing to put up with the commuting. When you look at those commuting figures, they're all the way down to Virginia Beach, down to Newport News on that. And the people that are coming in from Newport News and from Gloucester. I mean, there's some migration up into the Richmond area, but that's exactly why they live here.
And with the expansion of I-64, it's only going to continue, if not accelerate.
Right. And so is it a surprise that we're seeing on 199 at the lower end of that interchange, the city of Williamsburg putting more buildings and condominiums in there? Because you can hop on it and go to work. I mean, so we're a bedroom community. And
Almost all the multifamily housing built in James City County in recent years is right on an interchange,
Right.
either of 199 or I-64.
Right.
The quarter path project, that's in Williamsburg, but it's the same principle.
So why should it surprise us that the Stonehouse folks downzoned it and they took all the high density stuff and moved it over so that they can sell condominiums and townhouses right next to an interchange? Because that's the business model for them, because single family houses market is built out in this county. I mean, we don't need any more of that, to tell you the truth, another Kingsville, another Governor's Landing, or a Ford's Colony. And given the demographics that are changing out, there's going to be that housing capacity there. Now, Tim may have some ideas about that, but I think that's what we're seeing.
I think that's what we're seeing, but I think because of the 40 plus, when I say 40 plus, I'm talking about age, respondents want, they want the larger acred lots, and that's just not the reality of the marketplace.
Exactly.
It's we're not, this is just my opinion, but I don't think we captured well in this survey, and you all can correct me, is, what we expect out of technology in the next 5 to 10 years. And, where are we going to be with, 5G networks and what they support with driverless cars. I mean, it's amazing what you can see out there as far as future cityscapes and homes built in clusters. So delivery vehicles can drive and people will actually work as porters to get people's food, groceries, all those things and deliver them to people's units. So I'm not sure we're capturing what the future holds in store from technology. Don't know that we know it all, but again, I think it's commensurate with what I find in the younger demographic that I employ is they're willing to work, they want to work hard, but if you don't have anything for them to do, they want to go home because they want to run, ride bikes, go paddleboarding, canoeing, hiking. To me, that's the natural environment that they want to protect, not open space.
Right, so the rezoning, the downzoning of Stonehouse did exactly that. They put in more trails, more of this and more of that for people to go out. And so when they built that town center, it was, go get a cup of coffee and then go take a walk in the parks. So I absolutely agree. So the place types that we see on this thing, I agree, don't accommodate for what we're going to see in the technology in the future. It's yesterday. And so there needs to be some rethinking about what those place types mean in terms of more open space with maybe higher density in there, and you don't see that. So I agree with you, Tim.
Right. And that's so. There were a few of those that looked for those social opportunities, and I think it's important as we go through this process and we look at EO. Right now, we have the limitation on economic opportunity on the residential piece, but I think the model, and if we want to recruit businesses and we want younger people to stay in the Williamsburg area, we need to create that social space for them, both in terms of working, being able to walk to work, and stay connected with their Wi-Fi the whole time. I mean, that's where we're headed.
I don't disagree, and I think we have some wonderful opportunities with the 2 E zones that we have coming up to be able to do that, but that's another issue.
I think great points, and one of the ways we can reflect some of that is in the modeling. Particularly the travel demand model is looking at connected automated vehicles, looking at mode shifts, more transit, and we can also build that into some of the place types as far as the assumptions. Right now, they're kind of these words and pictures, and we're now building the data behind each place type. So very good points, and we certainly have heard that in many communities that the economic equation is to get educated workers, and the needs of the educated workers are walking, biking options, third places, social spaces, kind of higher density products. So,
And well-paying jobs.
yes.
To Tim's point about the different technologies, one of the things that I've always wanted to be able to see in the county is where the OC 48 and 24 lines are that go through. That's all the high-speed networking piece. So if you want to build something, you want to do something in tech, your availability to those lines is going to be dependent upon your choice. And the second thing is with the 5G piece, how the county does that given the current ordinances and how you go about that is problematic. And so if you're going to try to leverage those sorts of technologies, you need to be looking at what your current and future ordinances are to be able to accommodate those sorts of things. So we have no idea about what the infrastructure looks like for broadband, and I don't mean Cox. And I don't mean files either.
Were there any other, thank you for these comments, were there any other comments about what you heard on the public input or the themes? Because we can move to the modeling discussion and kind of take our time with that and get all your thoughts and questions answered on that.
I do have one question. In the survey results, you had some numbers by race and a few other economic indicators, but I didn't see economic indicators. Do you know, in terms of respondents, where they fell in terms of economic status in the county or in James City?
We did not ask that, kind of where your economic status was. I think the decision was just people's patience to answer a bunch of questions, because we had some fairly complex policy questions. But these few demographic questions we asked, we're going to hold consistent throughout. So every time we do another poll, we'll have similar kind of feedback. But no, we didn't ask economic. Any other questions?
And Vlad, this is Leanne. I was just going to add to your response on that last question and say that we often find people not responding to questions. If you ask them, say, what their annual income is, they often won't give you that answer. But sometimes you can start to understand, to some extent, the economics of who's responding based on where people live. And we did ask people to, show us the different places that they live and work. So we have some understanding of the different parts of the community that were represented, which can, to some degree, help us understand the economics of folks who were participating.
Thank you, Leanne. Okay, so as it says here, this is an update on building the models. Where we are, if you remember from that timeline of the process, we are deep into the construction of these integrated suite of models, and we'll be coming back to you shortly to talk about the actual scenarios. I'll share kind of where we are. But we have the Michael Baker team and the Tischler-Weiss team and EPR building these different models. Probably when we come back to you, we'll have representatives from them too, because we'll be getting really into more technical issues of the models. But what we want to share with you today is actually some of the parameters for what types of modeling we're doing, and some of the things like control totals and place types, and really get any input you have, because this is a very flexible, fluid time as we're building these models, and we can adjust the dials and parts of the machine to better meet what we want as an outcome for decision making. So first of all, kind of a recap. As we said before, this is not your average comprehensive plan because of this kind of more scientific modeling aspect of it. So if you want to get to the building the comprehensive plan all the way on the right, and you have this kind of cloud of uncertainty of not sure what the future is going to hold on the left, what this process proposes is organizing potential future outcomes into a series of different land use scenarios. One, of course, will be the kind of current policy framework. And then running them through these kind of three different scenarios, land use, what we called cumulative impacts, and fiscal impacts. And through the results of those and comparing those to the county kind of goals and vision, and working with the public and stakeholders, elected officials and appointed officials, coming out of it with a preferred future land use framework, and using that to inform the comprehensive plan. Not that that is the comprehensive plan, but that can really provide some good policy direction on the comprehensive plan. And then you can see the arrow at the bottom there, that these part of our objective here is to make these models available to the county for ongoing planning and future planning purposes, so they will live with the county staff. And these are, this is kind of a summary of the modeling. You note here that we call these slightly different names: land use model, the travel demand model, and the fiscal and other impacts model. And this is because as we're getting into building these models, we find that the public facilities and infrastructure, other than transportation infrastructure, really travels with the fiscal impact model. So the fiscal impact model is going to build all those cumulative impacts about facilities and parks and fire and libraries and schools and things like that into it. But all these have their own sets of indicators that we, basically performance metrics that we will be putting into some kind of dashboard framework. And the purpose of this is, again, allowing informed policy decisions, not necessarily data-driven, but data-guided, if you will, data-driven testing, but data-guided policy decisions. And we touched on this last time we were here in September. There's two broad approaches to the model, to any kind of scenario modeling. One is kind of a resilience test of your current policy framework. So that takes your current land use policy framework, the pattern of future land uses, the policies behind those, and tests it against different future scenarios. For example, if we have more or less population, more or less job growth, different kind of environmental, economic conditions, and sees sees how your current policy framework performs in the future against these different scenarios. The other is really holding those kind of future conditions constant and testing different policy frameworks. So in other words, you can envision different land use patterns, different land use policies, but you hold these common assumptions about the future, such as population and employment, constant, so that you can see which of these land use scenarios performs best and meets our goals the best. Those are two broad kind of ways of doing this. You know, we resilience test your current one, or you look at different alternative future ones. And what we're really proposing here, and this was confirmed to us by looking at the public input and your all input from September and county board, and just kind of the sum total is to do both options 1 and 2. So we want to test both the current and alternative future land use policy frameworks against a set of common assumptions about growth to see which one best meets the vision and goals. And you can see that diagram on the right. Assume a constant kind of future growth scenario, test both current and alternative land use scenarios, and perform these various scenario tests on them to come up with a preferred future land use framework. Feel free to stop at any point too as I go through these. I can answer questions.
Can I ask one quick question? So will you do your scenario testing based on our ordinances as they're written, or would we have the ability, so say if we were looking for higher density, somebody came in with a campus style, wanted a density greater than 10 units per acre, are we able to plug that in to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we are. It's not necessarily the zoning, it's more the future land use is your kind of baseline, and then we'll explore different future land uses with different density parameters.
Okay, thanks.
And note on the data. So as I mentioned last time, we have the benefit of this existing regional model from the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization. This allows us to get a jump start on data collection. We've got built-in data, particularly for the travel demand model. But we are also going through the process of correlating it to county data. One of the things this does for the county, though, is allows the process here of developing the comprehensive plan to inform regional transportation planning. So now when they do future transportation plans, they can use the county's preferred future vision that will be an outcome of this process in the same format that they use for their modeling in the future. But I mentioned on the right that it's customized with county data sources, so we're using county data to verify and confirm the current and future land uses, the value of the land and the improvements that goes directly into the fiscal impact model, facilities, levels of service. All this comes from departmental data, and of course, performance outputs and other metrics that are going to be sensitive to the vision and goals and input we've heard from the county. And then these are the proposed control totals. So I mentioned that this approach kind of needs to hold population and employment as a constant for testing against, to test different land use scenarios. The travel demand model in particular, we use 2015 data, which is built into the model. It because of the way it works, it basically needs to interpolate this projected to 2017. However, the land use and fiscal models will use the actual 2020 county data for what we call the virtual present. Yes,
That's quite a difference between population growth and employment growth.
it is.
This whole thing's going to be retirees, is that it? The whole-
We talked to the demographer for Hampton Roads as to where these came from, and of course a lot of them come from Weldon Cooper and state projections for the localities in the region. But that is the general pattern that they're seeing is that the employment growth is much less than the population growth throughout the region, I have to say, because this is the highest population growth in the region by locality, but the second highest employment growth in the region.
But it shouldn't be surprising in terms of the bedroom community piece. All it is an instantiation of that trend.
Yep.
And when you think about what the Richmond metro area is going to look like and what the HRTPO guys are trying to do with them, we're right in the middle. And we've got 64 to be able to have people commute.
Were there any assumptions on the population demographics of that 120,000? Whether part of that is an influx of retirees, which might account for the delta between the jobs and, to Frank's point, the bedroom community effect that we talked earlier. But I'm just wondering how much of that population is senior citizens and folks not in the workforce.
Yeah, there's actually a presentation that's been posted to the website of how the region derived these projections, but our understanding is they look at natural birth death rates, they look at immigration assumptions, the characteristics of that population as far as labor force participation rates, which accounts partly for the slow employment growth, that a lot of the newcomers have much lower labor force participation. Drawing a blank on what other factors, but there are another.
By right.
Factors.
By right. How many vacant parcels do you have that people can build on? That's the Weldon Cooper piece. And that's cranked into the 120. So when you look at the 15,000 by right parcels that we have, and you just do a quick multiplication of what the average household is going to look like in this time frame, which is not the 2.45 we have now, but 2.33. It's easy to see how you get that. Okay, and it's also kindergarten age children and the demographics that they're looking at, and believe it or not, vehicle registrations.
Oh, really?
Well, those are the other factors that the Weldon Cooper guys use for.
That's a good point. And yeah, there is a local component to it too as well. They look at kind of what is the pattern of approvals, comprehensive plan policies, things like that. But the most important point there is that third one. So, a lot of concern over are these the right numbers, or do we want to grow this, or is it destiny, the future? For scenario planning purposes is what we're using these for. And they don't represent a goal or a target for growth. You need a standard increment of growth to allow this kind of scientific testing, kind of holding that constant. And what we always say is we're using that as a module for testing. The growth could be a lot slower, so you could get to that number instead of in 25 years, it could take 50 years, or it could be more aggressive. You could get there in less than 25 years. It doesn't matter for testing purposes, because what the purpose of this is to show you how the different scenarios stack up against those control totals.
I'd add that when you go back and look at the HRTPO data, they've done one for 2010 and 2040. And when you compare the 2010, 2015, and what those changes are, they're almost the same. Okay, I mean, there's some adjustments in some of the TAZs, but it's pretty stable. So, in my mind, this is exactly your point. If it doesn't happen in 2045 or doesn't happen in 2040, it's going to happen in 2055, given the way they compute this stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So the next schedule for what we're doing in the immediate term is we're building what we call the virtual present. And within the next week, I think we hope to have kind of a data set of current conditions for that. Then February, we devote to building the virtual future. That is the 2045 conditions, or the baseline scenario, if you will. March, we're going to use to develop the scenarios, basically the scenario narratives, taking all the public input. I'll touch on that in a in a few minutes of how we build those. And then we want to come back to you in April to affirm how we got to these scenario narratives and make sure these are the right ones to be testing, because we want to run these scenarios and the models over the summer, come back to you and to the general public over the summer and ask them to weigh in on these different performance outputs of each scenario. So developing the scenario, again, the baseline, which is your current kind of land use policies, represents a business as usual or no policy change. It'll reflect the future land use in the Toward 2035 plan. We are going to correlate that to the HRTPO model place types, but it's basically going to be the same land use pattern and densities that are in your current plan. And then we're going to build 2 to 3 alternative scenarios. They will have different land use patterns than the baseline. We're going to take a summary of all the input received to date from public and elected appointed officials, and of course vet this with you before we start the testing. So April will be a very kind of important time to make sure we're on the right track before we invest all the time in the running the scenarios. And we shared this last time, but just a refresher. So these are the 21 place types in the model currently. James City County has correlated its Towards 2035 plan to these place types. We're now going through actually all 30,000 parcels to make sure that they match basically what's in the both the current and the future land use matches these place types. In other words, if it's, you might call it something like multifamily development in your comprehensive plan, whereas this calls it high density residential, but we want the basic place types to match. And you recognize on the left side and the center those place types that were in the visual preference survey. That's why we use those particular ones to get input on what kind of shape and character and density those should have. This is just the process that we're going through right now. On the left, you can see the correlating the pattern of current land uses in the county data sets to these HRTPO model place types. And on the right, you can see doing that with the future too.
I offer a comment that when I looked at the economic opportunity, which is in the MCI place states, the Anderson Corner Tohanna EO was not there. And then the second one is the down zoning that we had in the Stonehouse area is not reflected in its PUD, but that gets out and goes into A1 and limited. And that makes a big difference in terms of the population numbers that you have in that TAZ. Mm-hmm. Goes down big time. Mm-hmm. But you're going to have to figure out how to fudge that number into there. But that was two of the things that I noticed that didn't match up. And I know that you're going through this, but those are two just to watch out for.
The Stonehouse is the second. Did you get the first one? Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, because we are correcting them, but I think we do have the opportunity to change the TAZs even in the 2045, the TAZ control totals for each one to make them reflect what's there.
And the point of that is that when you take a look at the population growth of 40,000 that are there, most of that growth, almost more than half of it, is in the upper end of the county from Lightfoot up to the Stonehouse. So trying to figure out what the impacts are going to be on your traffic model are going to be impacted as you run different variations, I think.
Yep. Good points. For those of you who don't know the acronyms, TAZ is Transportation Analysis Zones, basically dividing the county into little units for studying transportation between trips between one and the other. So yeah, very good points. And then this is a flow chart to describe some of the interplay between the models. So each one of these models has its own set of indicators. You know, land use is going to have things like number of acres consumed in development, or how much impervious surface, for example, is in this scenario versus the other scenario. Travel demand model is going to have things like the average vehicle miles traveled in one scenario versus the other, or the level of congestion. economic and facilities will have the most, both fiscal impact and also kind of the impact on things like emergency response times or schools and things like that. But a lot of these are driven by the land use model itself. So you create a land use pattern in the land use model that goes into the travel demand model, which is going to create different patterns of transportation. It's also going to go into the fiscal model, which is going to create different patterns of service provision, emergency service or schools or things like that. It's also going to create different revenues and costs from the different land uses. So as an example, land use model might show a lot of development in one end of the county. That's going to create congestion in that end of the county in the travel demand model. That's going to be monetized or quantified in terms of we're going to need to expand roads this much. That is going to go into the fiscal model. So you can see how one model goes into the next one, goes into the next one. And they're all kind of summarized into this apples to apples comparison of scenario A to B to C. These are some working assumptions to run by you on each of the models. So as I mentioned, the land use model is going to use current county data on land use and density intensity. It's a parcel-based model, so we are able to use a much higher level of detail, granularity is the term, than the regional model. We're going to have all 30,000 or so parcels. They are going to use the HRTPO regional model data set for the place types and for the capacity of place types. In other words, how much each one can take on for jobs and population. And that gets to one of your questions about density. We can set those and adjust them for kind of county zoning or county future land use, or for the scenario narrative if one of the scenarios needs to have higher density place types. And then lastly, scenario narratives will drive these land use patterns. So it'll be kind of a blank canvas in each of the scenarios based on the scenario narrative, which could say something like, this scenario envisions growth in this type of places, in this portion of the county, whatever the kind of overarching vision for each scenario will be, that will drive the land use patterns. And then on transportation, we've determined that this will be a customized standalone county model. It will be able to plug back into the regional model, but it will be something that the county will be able to do much more fine-grained, I think, assessments of transportation than the regional model can do right now for the county. It will use the regional model data on current and future assumptions for the baseline, basically pull from the regional model on what the 2045 conditions are. And then it will use the land use model for the 2045 conditions under each scenario. And then finally on fiscal, as I mentioned, it'll use current budget year for current conditions, current land valuations, improvement valuations. The future, the 2045 will come from the land use model for the alternative scenarios. We'll be able to divide the county into sub-areas to analyze the impacts. For example, rural lands versus PSA, northern parts of the county, southern parts it'll have that flexibility. And an important one is levels of service will be held constant across scenarios to compare outputs. So, for example, emergency response. Let's say emergency response averages 10 minutes or something like that. You don't want to have different levels of service for all the different scenarios because then you don't have an apples to apples comparison. We'll hold it constant at whatever it is, 10 or 12, what the current rate is. And then we'll see scenario A might say, okay, that gives an average response time that is 8 minutes, or scenario B is 15 minutes. So you might have to add a fire station in one of those. That will then plug into the fiscal impacts. They'll generate more capital costs. And that will allow us to compare the relative impact of these different land use patterns in each scenario. I hope that makes sense, that we need to have some things constant so we can see the differences between the scenarios. Yeah,
But too, what's interesting with this? Do you have experience with other communities that are further down the road using this type of model? Because what I'm thinking is you can have a model in a scenario saying, "Oh, okay, our capital budget." 10 years down the road, we need to start building in a school, a firehouse, and so on and so forth. But then in that interim period, if you change some of your policies, whether it be your densities, your zoning districts, whatever, all of a sudden some of those requirements would go away. And it's certainly a balance, but I think you also could end up chasing the models and trying to allocate money to meet scenarios, long-range scenarios that you have more control over. But I assume all of this is sort of a give and take where other jurisdictions, other communities that have implemented this have learned how to not chase the predictions necessarily.
Yeah, if I'm understanding, what your question is, what happens if you change land use patterns, policy frameworks in midstream?
Mm-hmm.
You plan for, you need this school here, but these
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Loudoun County is a good example, and Tischler Bice built the model for Loudoun County, and they do use it for school projection, public facilities, things like that. And my understanding is that it is very flexible in that. Now, this one is tied to a land use model too, and not all of these are tied to a land use model. So some of them just say, if your population increases by this much, you'll need this many schools. Some of them segmented by the northern part of the county, the southern part. Our modeling will actually have, kind of every parcel accounted for as to what's going to happen.
So this is a more sophisticated modeling exercise.
It is, but it's not quite as quick to change a land use pattern as it is to just change a spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
But it still will have that flexibility. Yes.
Thanks.
So will the county staff have the ability, just, I'm just thinking in terms of like the EDA, if somebody approached the county to say, we wanted to bring X number of jobs here, we, relocate a corporate headquarters or something like that. So would the staff have the ability to then create sort of an optimization model to say, if plug in the knowns, it's this many homes, it's this many square feet of commercial, it's this, and then say, we can do that if it's on 300 acres and identify those parcels in the county, or would it have to be the reverse of this is what we want, and then look at the different places and build it into the model?
I think it's the former. So this model will allow scenario testing not only at this broad scale, but with individual parcels. So there'll be a standard set of performance indicators, outputs, and you'll be able to, once it's all done and in the county's hands, they should be able to change a land use in this parcel or this group of parcels and read out what this means in terms of impervious surface, fiscal impact, transportation. So that's what it's designed for, yes.
Okay.
So it'll get down to that micro level.
It will, it will be able to do parcel level. The only consideration is, the outputs are kind of county-wide. So it's like, you change one 3-acre parcel, what's that going to do to the fiscal
So it
picture of
won't
the
say
county?
if this parcel is developed differently, then the traffic on this arterial road is going to change.
It will to, not to the level of like intersections, but yes, it will have, within the model architecture, the travel demand model, you'll be able to tell this corridor goes from this level of service to that level of service.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is local streets it won't capture, but major streets, yes. Good questions.
I apologize to step out, but thank you very much. It's been helpful.
Thank you. So this is just kind of slide on building the scenario narratives. It just shows the various inputs that we're going to use, the countywide survey, all the input from the summit, particularly the visual preference survey is going to help us with this, the input we've collected from these meetings and other input. And of course, analysis of these by county and consultant staff to really build these alternative scenarios. And that's something we'd particularly invite your discussion on. Obviously, we're way ahead of April, and you don't have to react to anything yet. But if there are particular features of scenarios that you think should be considered, consistent with these themes, for example, nature, affordable housing, things like that, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that as we get into the process of really building these scenario narratives.
Do you mind forwarding to us this part of the presentation?
Sure.
That'd be a big help.
And is that already on the website? Or?
It is.
Oh, it is, excuse me. It's on the website, but not what you sent us, right?
Yeah. On the 2045, there's a download button that'll give you this briefing.
I missed it. Okay, never mind, sorry.
As you know, both from you and Leanne, is that I circulated a paper among the commissioners, and what I questioned was the ability of the model to take into consideration the impacts on the environment and the natural piece. And what I suggested to you was use of the impervious surface modeling to be able to do that. And I've heard you use that word 3 times in the land use thing, which I was pleased to hear on that. And so the idea is that I would like to make sure that when we use that and we look at the different alternatives of the scenario, that we have a way of being able to assess at the sub-watershed level the impact of that growth, as well as the downstream effects of that for it. And there is a suggestion that I put in one of the papers that I gave to you this weekend on the watershed zoning piece that has a land use component to that. So I am very interested to make sure that we have an opportunity to do that. When it came to the different scenarios that you're going to offer in there, I suggested 2 things. Is a relook at the Hills, Moortown Hills, Pleasant Farm EO zone, and the impacts of traffic that's going to have both in your TAZ model, not so much from us, but from the York County folks and their build out of that area and what's projected in their TAZ model that's laid out there. So we already have a problem at that Lightfoot intersection, both from an environmental point, from both the Skimino and of the Yarmouth, but we also have a traffic and a population piece. So when you look at the place types themselves and you're looking to correlate with the land use models they're looking at today, I think it's important also to look at the vacancy in the subdivisions and relook at the household growth figures in the 2045 for those areas. So for example, in the Mill Creek and Powhatan areas, they're showing growth, and I don't know where they think they're going to get the land to do it, and there aren't vacancies for pieces of property. So I think there's some adjustments in some of those areas in the models in the same way that you need to make an adjustment for the Stonehouse in terms of what those population figures are for it. So the idea is that I'm hoping that we get a land use model that reflects the outputs of the model itself, okay? So that you can say, okay, if you don't want to do this, here's the way you can apply a policy like a water zone to cap that zoning area in there. The other piece on the scenario is I've offered you the idea that I gave Leanne the last time on the Lower Chickahominy, where there is an economic development model that says ecotourism, which is not a new word for the county and something that we've made investments on. But it does a couple of things, is it gets to what is it that you want to preserve? So as we talked about before the meeting, that map that you have in there with the red dots and the blue dots on that, there were preponderance, as you said, in land that's already conserved and preserved. So what is the land outside of that area that we want to preserve, and what are the monies that we're doing that in terms of the land use model? So if you're going to do the parcel level, one of the issues is what is the land that's not protected either in a temporary conservation easement or a permanent conservation easement that's in an area that's worth preserving, back to the eco core and all that. And those parcels are over 100 acres. So they may become target parcels for a change in a scenario for the rural areas, or it may be an opportunity for the county to invest in a PDR program or some other conservation area. So the scenarios associated with the other two should be reflective of either preserving or not preserving areas of the county. So it becomes relevant in terms of what the outputs are associated with that to the rest of the services. But the last thing I wanted to make, which, you take the assumption of the 2020 budget for it. And I mentioned to you last time that the county is doing a 10-year CIP, which we've never done, and we have one for the schools. And so it seems to me if we're going to make projections about the fiscal impact on the county from the known, you need to at least have some idea about what the county's already going to spend or planning to spend over that 10-year period. And that's more than what's reflected in the 2020 budget by a long shot for it. So the combination of those two, to me, makes sense to be able to crank out what the fiscal impacts are, since we have some knowns about that. The last piece that I had in the modeling one is that we've been doing concurrently with the City of Williamsburg, York County, and James City County with the VDOT guys to relook at the transportation piece. And I have no idea where that is and what it's saying, but I would think that some of the conclusions that are in there are going to be relevant to what some of the traffic congestion areas are that are projected in there, that we may be able to get some other insights. And one of the examples I'm specifically thinking about is the Lightfoot corridor and the Moortown corridor that border from both counties. Okay. So that notion of looking at the economic opportunity zones in the upper set of the county as a scenario, both the Tohanna, Anderson Corner, Barnesville interchange, is a variant of the scenario that I would like to see, as well as doing away with the Hillcrest scenario for economic development. And the outputs of those are going to tell you a lot, but it's also going to say a lot about where we don't want growth in already congested areas of the county.
Well, that's some excellent input for us, and we're going to have to look at the minutes as well as our summary here on those. And yes, thank you for providing the data points in the white paper. We've looked at those. I guess we're definitely going to use that to inform how we build, particularly the outputs of these scenarios. So your points about watershed impacts, for example, some caveats and some opportunities there. This is not a watershed modeling. It is place type modeling, but we do have the ability to output things like impervious surface cover. And the good thing is that it is on a parcel level rather than a TAZ level. So we'll have to make some assumptions about what the impervious cover is for each place type in terms of parking and buildings. But you should be able to get at a sub-watershed level, at any level you want, the outcome of how much impervious cover you have from this scenario.
Absolutely. And if you take the household growth in your 2045 TAZ models, you have a notion about roads, impervious surfaces on roofs, driveways, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that hard to correlate by a TAZ where that growth is going to occur because you have it there. Yeah. And it's also, in the paper, I've correlated the watershed, sub-watershed levels to the TAZs.
Yes.
So there is a way to be able to precisely say, based on the data that we've had on these studies, as an example. So you could go to the 218 Skimino York and look at the impacts of what's there now, and then what you're projecting for growth on either side.
I think we will be able to use some of that data. See, normally without that data, we would let the place types tell us what the existing impervious cover is. But if we have actual impervious cover data, we can
You do down at the sub-watershed level for it. And so what I did in that paper then is said, okay, if based on the TAZ, and you're going to project to this sub-watershed, what is the likelihood of that growth? And so you could look at the vacancy lot piece to be able to correlate by subdivision where that growth is going to take place within that sub-watershed. Mm-hmm. And there is an informed opinion by not me, but by the people that did that, about what that increase is going to be. So what you're going to essentially do is say 10 to 25, that's not good.
Right.
Keeping it from 0 to 10 is a good idea. And for those areas of the county that are at 1/10 to 3/10% of that, we want to do something about preserving that.
Yep, you remind me of one other caveat there, which I'm sure you know, is we're not getting an implementation with this modeling. We're showing the outcome in terms of, as this watershed gone to 10 to 25% or something like that. But as far as what you do with that, that's in the kind of implementation section of the comprehensive plan.
I take a little bit of an exception to that by saying that given the scenarios that you provide, they're going to tell you about a growth and that level of increase. And so from an implementation point of view, there is, for this comp plan, a land use map that will be derived. And so what you could do is, based on the state code for a watershed map zoning piece, you could superimpose that over that land use map and have an output that says to the county, here's what happens if you do this kind of a development.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, that yes, this will be able to model what the impacts are if you do this kind of land use status versus that. But whether you change the zoning to have that land use.
That's another issue, but you provide that overlay on top of that land use of whatever that scenario is for the county to decide, we don't want to do development of the rural area of this county. We want to preserve it.
Yeah, well, again, like we say, that's an implementation decision.
Right.
The one other point I think you made was a good one, but I did want to touch a little bit on the way the model works. The economic impacts of preserving rural land or putting land in conservation areas or that whole topic. So the model is going to look at economic impacts, revenue, and cost impacts through land use changes. So there's going to be a built-in kind of assumptions about the tax revenue and the cost of different place types, as well as facilities and things like that. But each place type will have its own kind of, low-density residential typically has this impact on taxes, this impact on costs, and brings in this much on revenues. So that's probably how we will be projecting what the economic benefits, if you will, of certain conservation things are.
I'd like you to add and at least consider this, is that when the economic analysis was done for the Lower Chickahominy, what the county did was provided the contractor all of the parcel data that's already in a conservation, and then assigned a dollar value to it, which is how they came up with, if you put $1 in a conservation, you get $1.53. So we know already at the parcel level of detail which parcels are there. So the only thing that's really needed is what are the additional parcels that you may want to put in there to move forward. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to buy something. It may be it's not developable.
Right.
Okay? But the point is that at the parcel level, that analysis has been done. But what are the areas that you want to preserve? And what is the bill?
That's where you do the risk analysis to say, this is under imminent threat, this not so much.
Exactly.
And you use your PDR money wisely.
Or you continue to fund the AFD, and that economic break is what you get the cost as a tax relief.
Yeah.
The second piece of that for the economic is that this county has spent upwards of $21 million from 208 to probably 224 for correcting impervious surfaces problems. So there is a way for us to put a dollar value on what it means if you keep the impervious surface down. It doesn't mean you need to spend more money on correcting those problems in the sub-watersheds that we have. So, I think there are ways that the model can accommodate those parameters, but, that's not, I don't know.
Okay. Well, it's, again, excellent information to have at this stage as we're building these. We're in good timing as far as a lot of those are performance measures. So we're not really building the performance measures till we've got the scenario narratives in April, but it's great to have them now, and we'll plug them into as we build those. So. I think we had just one other slide.
I want to say one
Next
last
steps.
thing, and I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
Feel free.
on this, is the sea level rise that shows up in there.
Yes.
When you take a look at the paper, you're going to see the impacts at the watershed levels on where, and the migration of what we're going to have and what probably are going to have, and it has a different problem. So, for example, in the Mill Creek, I think we're talking about the tidal area of salt salinity moving on the other side of Jamestown Road. It goes up that far. And the same thing is true for the Gordon and the Yarmouth. So there are some other ways for us to look at what those impacts are that we're going to see for it, and whether or not that area we should do something about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw that in the analysis you provided. And you reminded me also the travel demand model will look at the impact of sea level rise in terms of changing the network, cutting off certain parts of the network too.
Right.
So, good points. Okay, so just to close with next steps in the process, we're going to complete building the model in March, develop these scenario narratives and come back to you in April, test the land use scenarios over the spring and summer, and share the results of that testing with you and the public in the summer. And that is all with a view to having this preferred scenario affirmed in the fall. And that's really a kind of a transition point in the process, using all that input and all that testing to build the new comprehensive plan element by element, as we say, informed by the preferred scenario. So, great discussion. I think we have a few more minutes. I'll turn it back to Tammy.
Well, just to give us a complete picture, I wanted to go back to the beginning of our presentation and talk about community engagement. We are planning another round of community engagement efforts in the coming months. In March, we will be having our CPT forum, which will allow organizations to make presentations to the community participation team on how their organization's mission is informed by the comprehensive plan, and how what we study and implement through the comprehensive plan can aid their vision for the community. But tying into this modeling, we have a broad community engagement effort planned in late summer, tied into the alternatives testing. And then we have another round of community engagement tied into choosing the preferred scenario, which would occur late fall, early winter. So I just wanted to let you know that we've got many more opportunities for the community to get engaged, formally and informally, and we are trying to integrate it into these decision points that we're making through our modeling and integrate it into the broader discussion of the comprehensive plan.
So we need to keep wearing our buttons.
Yes, absolutely. And this is just a good opportunity. If you have any questions about the process, how we're going to get from A to B, or anything that we haven't covered in today's presentation, we'd be happy to cover for you.
I thought it was an excellent summary and discussion. This was a very, I think, thought-provoking hour or so. Got a lot of good inputs from folks around the table, and Frank obviously has done a lot of homework on modeling. So excellent.
We'll be
I think-
sharing. I'm sorry.
Also, the CPT, I think, has done an excellent job. The citizen participants, staff, consultants. It's hard to imagine any one resident in James City County not having heard of this endeavor and given an opportunity to participate if they want to. And it's been a great process. It really has.
And I think we all still have a thirst to engage more citizens. So I'm looking forward to those opportunities coming forward to capture new people into the process.
Amen.
Do you envision having online participation going forward too? So opportunities for that in the future?
Yes, we certainly hope that we can accomplish that. We haven't decided which form that will take, what opportunities we'll have to do that, but we've certainly talked to Vlad and Todd and Leanne about ways to accomplish that. I did want to bring up one other thing I failed to mention. The work of the CPT and the discussions that we've had today are all funneling into a Board of Supervisors work session at the latter part of this month, February 25th. We're using different points in the process to check in with them so that they can have a similar opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback.
Thank you for great input and diving into some of the technical details. So we'll try to keep it user-friendly as we go too, because we know that this is important for everyone to understand. So.
Thank you.
Anything else for the
Motion to
good of
adjourn.
the cause? Motion to adjourn? All in favor?
Aye.
So done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne.
Hey.
Acronym.
Good night.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Leanne.